Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Muris. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. This is the first new interview I've done in a few weeks. Was on sort of a hiatus there, but I'm glad to be back. I've got a great guest, Robert Reilly. He is as an eclectic scholar as this show is eclectic. He's written books about classical music. He's a classical music critic. He's written about Islam. He's written about homosexuality. And his latest book from Ignatius Press is America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding. This is a defense, not as you might expect, of the founding against attackers on the radical left, but it's more of a defense against the critics of the American founding on the right. Men like Patrick Deneen, Michael Hanby, those are the principal scholars that he's responding to, but you could say maybe to kind of criticisms in the integralist crowd more generally. And it's one of those books that even if you were to read it and not fully agree with the author's argument, the book still amply justifies its own existence just with the sheer scope and quality of the scholarship involved. It traces the deep roots of the founding, going far back beyond the Enlightenment to the ancient world. And I learned a whole heck of a lot from reading it. Robert Reilly, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you. A delight to be with you.
There's a point you make towards the end of the book, and it rightly is not the central argument you make, because you're talking about, what are the consequences of the view that we have of our nation's founding in terms of our ability to be patriotic, our ability to serve our country, especially young people, if their professors are telling them that the founding of their nation is fundamentally irreconcilable with the natural law or with the Catholic faith. That is important. Of course, simply determining the truth of the matter is more important. But let me ask you this, because it kind of speaks to the stakes of this. I recently had a conversation on this show with a young author named Brandon McGinley, who had a book on restoring Catholic culture in America. And his book kind of takes for granted that American principles and Catholic principles are in contradiction. And I asked him about this, and he simply said, well, we don't need to, for the purposes of my book, determine all that. My point is that we don't have to be patriotic on the terms of our nation's legal establishment. In other words, if America is just and solely what they call a propositional nation, then if the proposition is wrong, we're done for. But if America sure involves a certain legal founding and a legal establishment, but also involves cultures and peoples that existed prior to the political founding of the nation as we know it, then that somewhat lowers the stakes on our views of the legal principles of the founding at least in terms of our ability to be patriotic at some level. So I was wondering, what do you think of that? How does that affect your view of the stakes of this argument?
Well, I think you're right in saying either the proposition is true or it's not. And if it's not, we're in a great deal of trouble. The central proposition is that all men are created equal. And that was a proposition that the founders explicitly stated was immutable and transcendent, based on a transcendent truth, that all people are created equal by their creator. As you know, God is mentioned 4 times in the Declaration of Independence, and the natural theology contained therein, I would contend, is compatible with Christianity, as the vast majority of American colonists were Christian. Now, if someone is going to attack that proposition, I should like to know on what grounds. And we know that, of course, America had to fight for its independence on those grounds. They didn't believe they were being treated as the equality of all men is required by Great Britain most particularly by the Parliament, which had claimed in the Declaratory Act that it had unlimited power to legislate anything about affecting the American colonies without their consent. Part of being equal as rational human beings with free will is that consent is required in that rule. That's not something the colonists made up. That was a very well-known principle in the Middle Ages that led to the development of constitutional principles. So my book, as you know, it's not just answering Deneen and Hanby. It's that Deneen and Hanby agree with people such as Justice Anthony Kennedy, or I presume they agree, when Anthony Kennedy in his misbegotten Supreme Court decision said they were based on the autonomy of man. And one presumes that Hanby and Deneen would agree that the autonomy of man that Justice Kennedy discerns in the American Constitution or founding is actually there. So that the misbegotten Obergefell decision mandating homosexual so-called marriage, the Lawrence versus Texas case finding a constitutional right to sodomy, again by Justice Kennedy, that's all congruent with the American founding principles. My book contends that that's absolutely not true, that there's no evidence for that case. That notion of radical individual autonomy is completely absent from the founders' thinking and from what they wrote. So my critique affects not just that criticism from, let's say, the conservative Catholic and Christian thinkers, but from thinkers such as Kennedy himself and others who have taken abortion, pornography, no fault abortion, name the litany of moral ills in our society that they say are constitutional rights. The argument is just as much against them. And the main proposition of the book is to ask, well, if Kennedy's wrong, if Patrick Deneen is wrong, whose fault is it? If it's not the fault of the founding principles, whose fault is it? In the end of the book, I try to address or suggest an answer to that question. But more to the point, from where did the ideas that made the American founding possible, they didn't just arrive in 1776. They all have a lineage that is, in fact, quite ancient, that is at the heart of Western civilization as it developed in ancient Israel, in the monotheism of the Jews, in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, and their discovery of reason's ability to apprehend reality, to know the truth as distinct from opinion, to know the essences or the natures of things as they really are. This was a revolutionary discovery at the time. And then the most revolutionary of them all was the incarnation. The confluence of these influences is what really made the American founding possible. And I would contend that it's not comprehensible if it is seen outside of those developments. And particularly, as you know, I spend a good deal of time dealing with what exactly those three contributions were, how Athens and Jerusalem were conjoined in Rome, by which I mean Christianity, and how that blossomed in the Middle Ages into the beginning of constitutional government.
Yeah, and I think one of the really valuable things about the book is that it doesn't just sort of make a general vague appeal to, Athens and Jerusalem and Roman law, but it really traces those principles as they were developed through the ages, the debate over them through the whole past, 2,000 years, or I suppose, the first 1,800 years or so, in particular, of Christianity. And not only in theory, but in practice, and particularly in the context of medieval jurisprudence. So people can see that there were things that were still principles that were not just present in seed form, but actually explicitly elaborated, at least as early as like the high Middle Ages. So that's very valuable in itself. And in fact, that's one of the things that I wanted to go into in this conversation is the second chapter of your book, one of the longer chapters on the Middle Ages. To preface that, though, in your first chapter, it's a fascinating chapter as well. You talk about pre-philosophical cultures and the lack of any such thing as a secular state, because there was kind of like almost a pantheism, a metaphysical confusion between men and animals and things and gods. Everything is kind of shifting. There's no constant. And kind of the way that philosophy began to free people from this, and then Christianity taking it further, Judaism and Christianity. One really great point that you made is that Christianity from the very beginning kind of de-absolutized the state by teaching that the destiny of man is outside of this world. And because of that, you point out, and you quote an author who really intrigued me. I can't remember his name. He wrote a book called The Ancient City, which I definitely want to read after this.
Fustel de Coulanges.
Yeah, there were a few quotes by him that were really interesting in the book. And he points out that Christianity elevated the private virtues over the public ones, and which means that the political no longer dominates. In other words, in Greek philosophy, it was the public virtues and the good of the polis, of the city-state, that was considered all important. And Christianity doesn't consider that unimportant, but it elevates the private virtues because those are what, get you into heaven. And in fact, ensure the final good of the polis for all eternity, for that matter.
If I can say, that's an extremely important point. And it's an extremely important point in this debate, that it's Christianity that forever diminished the role of the state, precisely because of the relationship between Christ and each individual person, and that salvation did not come through some relationship with the semi-divine ruler of the polis or the empire. It came from a transcendent God who was above the polis or the empire. So participation in that state was no longer the means by which man would reach his highest end. Now, the state denuded of that became a much lesser thing. And that in itself was revolutionary. I love the reaction in the Gospels when they try to trick Christ with a denarius, and he says, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." They were amazed, the Gospel says, of the crowd. Indeed, they would be amazed, as no one had ever said such a thing before. And that very famous passage from the Gospel is taken as one of the foundational texts in Christianity for the separation of church and state, of the secular and the sacred, that these are two realms. And this led to the development within Christendom of the dual sovereignty of church and state. This is immensely important.
Yeah, I was reflecting on that passage that you cited, and as with everything our Lord said and did, there's so much to draw from it. One is, it's not made explicit, but he asks, what image is on the coin? And they say Caesar's, and he says, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and give to God what is God's. Well, what image is on the human person? The human person is made in the image of God. So that would indicate, by Christ's logic, that the human person does not belong to Caesar, but he belongs to God, ultimately.
That's an excellent point, because you have in Genesis another revolutionary statement in its recitation of the creation of the world, that God made man in his own image and likeness. I don't think anywhere in the Middle Eastern mythologies or cosmologies you could find anything approaching this, that each person is made in the image of God, And this is the source of the sanctity, of the inviolability of the person. I think Genesis is, in a way, the basis of Western civilization due to the profundity of that revelation. And of course, Judaism was a tribal religion, even though Yahweh was a universal God. And it was Christianity which universalized that teaching, and added to it was the revelation of God's infinite love for each person. Each person is the object of an ineffable love from God. Once again, the value of that person it becomes so extraordinary, quite beyond the imagination of ancient man or of pagan man. And that man is even more inviolable as the result of that, and the obligations of one person to another in light of that infinite love that God has for them, again, that obviously is a foundational revelation for Western civilization.
It's also the along with the fact that we were all created by God in His image. It's the basis of the Christian sense of equality, not the modern progressive sense of egalitarianism, but equality in the Christian sense has its basis there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you could see in Democracy in America, de Tocqueville makes that point, that it was Christianity that revealed to mankind the equality of all human beings. And that without Christianity, we may not have arrived upon that truth, though, of course, it was articulated in philosophy by some thinkers, some ancient thinkers, some Roman thinkers.
Another point that you make, a very interesting point about this passage with Christ discussing what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to gods, is that, yes, in a sense, Christ did diminish the authority of Caesar here, but in distinguishing what is God's from what is Caesar's, he also set the basis for Caesar's genuine authority in his proper realm, which, as you say, is not to try and fulfill man's highest end. But you see the beginnings of a Christianity in demarcating these realms, actually for the first time, kind of granting an explicit God-given authority to Caesar.
Yes, absolutely. That all authority comes from God, and the temporal authority exercised by the secular ruler also comes from God. But of course, the tremendous dispute is whether that secular ruler receives that authority directly from God, or whether it is conveyed through the people whom that ruler oversees. The sovereignty sovereignty is ultimately God's, but is it in the people whose consent is required for the rule of the king, or is the king divinely appointed? That, as you know, was a huge struggle later in later developments.
So you mentioned the idea of dual sovereignty, the two swords of Pope Gelasius, the separate sovereignties exercised over the same people, but in different respects. So obviously, we've seen the basis of this in the gospel. How in practice and in explicit theory does this begin to develop in the late ancient world in the Middle Ages?
Well, of course, as you know, Pope Gelasius articulated this in his exchange with the emperor at the time, but soon thereafter, with the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the West fell into disarray, during which actually the church played a larger role because secular authority had disintegrated, and the bishops by default came to exercise a good deal of secular authority as well. But as there was an eventual recovery from this period of time, and then in the early Middle Ages, it was more the case that the kings and the princes came to exercise not only secular authority, but they took upon themselves some ecclesiastical authority as well. They considered kingship sacred, that they were in a way alter Christus. And that began the struggle between the Pope, the Church, and the kings to demarcate the authority of the ecclesiastical order as against the secular order. And that took the form, most specifically and energetically, over who gets to appoint the bishops, as the kings and princes had taken that upon themselves. It was beginning in the 11th century, wrested back by the popes. And in the course of the Middle Ages, the demarcation between the spiritual and secular realms became clearer. And as I contend in the chapter on the Middle Ages, the dual sovereignty, this was absolutely a unique situation, that the same individuals were subject to dual sovereigns. Neither sovereign comprehended everything about that individual person. The secular ruler could exercise authority only in those terrestrial matters of keeping civic order and providing for the common good, whereas the spiritual order obviously had in mind those things necessary for man's salvation in Christ and his ultimate destiny in Christ. So there were, as you know, ecclesiastical courts and there were secular courts. Sometimes they oversaw some of the same issues, and sometimes people would flee from one jurisdiction to another, where they thought they might get a better hearing for their case in an ecclesiastical court than a secular one. So let's say in the interstices between these two sovereignties grew quite a space of individual freedom. And that dual sovereignty, what we can talk about, why don't you ask another question, but we can then get into how is it that these constitutional principles developed in that situation.
Sure. So you have a line, I guess it's St. Robert Bellarmine saying that Pope Leo said this. I don't know if we have Pope Leo's original words or not, but the idea is that apparently Pope Leo I said that the emperor is elected and his authority is from God, not from the Pope. So that's kind of interesting too, because it both indicates that the emperor's authority is not absolute, and it doesn't come directly from God, but it also says that the emperor in his temporal authority is not received from the church. So I guess my question is, we know as a historical fact that at the same time that the Pope was finally winning the investiture controversy, he also was declaring that there were limits to his own power. Pope Innocent III said this. What were the reasons given at the time by the church for why the church couldn't just be the temporal as well as the spiritual governor of the whole world?
Well, I think because of what we have already discussed were the foundational teachings within Christianity, that Caesar had legitimate authority in the secular realm. And the Pope didn't, except insofar as he exercised secular authority within his own realm of, say, the Papal States. His mission was completely different. I mean, once you acknowledge that the destiny of man is not comprehended by the secular state, and that it is the mission of the church to shepherd man to that spiritual end for which he was made, at least you have a pretty good notion of how responsibilities are demarcated between these two sovereignties, and that for the Pope to exercise and eliminate the distinction between those two sovereignties would be, in a way, every bit as much an offense for the secular ruler to eliminate the Pope and take upon himself the spiritual authority. And this was this was acknowledged by both sides, even in the most bitter controversies. as one would accuse the other, no, you're transgressing my realm. I acknowledge your realm and wouldn't dare transgress it. So get back on your own turf, more or less.
Well, I think a lot of people would be surprised to realize that the Middle Ages were not the age of absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. That came later, kind of with Protestantism. Although once it was introduced in Protestantism or in the context of voluntaristic philosophy, certain Catholic, as you point out, certain Catholic kings were happy to take advantage of the idea. But there's a very striking quote, and I can't remember if you cite it in your book, but I read it elsewhere at the very least. This is an Aragonese oath in medieval Spain, their oath of allegiance to the king. We who are so good as you swear to you who are no better than we to accept you as our king and sovereign lord, provided you observe all our liberties and laws, but if not, not. Now that's very striking as a medieval document. It sounds positively modern to us, and yet it's this ancient idea. Where do we get the development of this idea that the king has a responsibility to respect the ancient customs of the land over which he reigns?
Well, first of all, that quote is in the book.
It is in the book.
Yeah, along with a number of others. I think someone from Hungarian
Yes,
nobles,
I remember that. Yeah,
etc. So, as extraordinary as that sounds, it was almost a commonplace in the Middle Ages. The divine right of kings was a doctrine that developed as a result of the Protestant Reformation and was always considered a heresy in the Catholic Church.
almost blasphemous, it was considered.
Yeah, there was no divine right of kings in the Middle Ages. And there were several reasons for this. And these we're now getting to the development of these constitutional principles. One, of course, was the acknowledgement of equality, including equality before the law, and of popular sovereignty. In other words, Thomas Aquinas, all the major thinkers had to address this question from where the king or the prince obtained his authority. Granted, all authority comes from God, but did God give it directly? We mentioned this earlier, and they all answered in the same way. No, God doesn't give it directly. There's not sort of one person who is so superior to all the others that he would have this from God, and his lineage would possess this authority uncontested as it comes directly from God. None of them said that was true. They said sovereignty, God invests the people with sovereignty, who are all equal, and their consent in their rule is required. And that is as true in a monarchy as it is in a mixed regime, as a consequence of which the king must respect the compact with the people through which he obtained the authority in the first place. And if he doesn't keep that compact, if he becomes a tyrant, the people have a right to revolution. This again was broadly acknowledged throughout the Middle Ages. Now, I'd like to get into a little more detail about the development of these constitutional principles.
Sure. So let's talk about the development of ecclesiastical law in a universal systematic way for the first time in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and this was inspired by the rediscovery of the Justinian Code and the attempt within the Justinian Code to rationalize Roman law, which had been a hodgepodge of case histories and so forth. And canon law was a kind of a hodgepodge too. And the canonists were inspired. We too need to rationalize our system of canon law. I think the Concordance of the Discordance was the name of the first major effort to do that. And in the systematization of canon law. Within the canon law, they took, however, not a principle, but a ruling from Roman law that applied solely to private cases. And that principle was, quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbari. What touches all must be approved by all. What did that mean in private Roman law? It meant that if you had trustees of a minor or trustees of a piece of property, before the property could be disposed of or the decisions made on the minor's behalf, all the trustees had to agree. That's what quod omnes tangit meant. Now, the canonists in the Middle Ages expanded upon the meaning of this into a principle, and it became the heart of the creation of the first corporations ever created in the world. And those were the ecclesiastical corporations created in the Middle Ages. Whether they were in a diocese, bishoprics, or religious orders, these corporations, these sort of fictional entities, were treated as persons. And within them, they were guided by this principle that what touches all must be approved by all. This would lead to the elections of abbots. This would lead to the rules for the conduct of, say, the Dominican order. And it would certainly lead, and it most especially did lead, to the requirement of consent by anyone affected by financial matters and sort of a taxation. And this became the principle of church councils as well, and was articulated by the popes, that what touches all must be approved by all. And when the Pope intervened on a more local matter of the decision of a bishop against a cleric or whatever, the principle of review would be this quod omnes tangit, that the person who was affected by the legislation, the taxation, if their consent had not been sought for its application, then it was invalid. And in fact, in the development of church councils, the ruling became, well, what does approval mean? What does approbation mean? And they said, well, it's a 2/3 majority would establish that. And by the way, it was within this requirement of consent. First of all, consent is required by equality. How is the consent expressed if not everyone can be there? For instance, when St. Dominic called the first convocation of the Dominican abbeys, not all the members of the order could go to Ferrari or wherever the meeting was, so they elected representatives to go. And the representatives were invested with authority to make decisions on behalf of that Dominican chapter. And they would arrive at this general convocation, and St. Dominic and his successors made absolutely clear that the decisions made by this convocation would apply to the whole order, including to St. Dominic himself. He was subject to their decisions. So this was quite an extraordinary development. So you had the equality, the sort of even the popular sovereignty within a religious order, the requirement of consent, the representation through which the consent was exercised, a kind of right to vote. And as these religious orders spread throughout Europe, and as the Dominicans arrived in England, their behavior was observed, how they conducted their affairs. Other religious orders imitated them in all the respects I just mentioned. And as you know, canonists didn't serve only in ecclesiastical functions, they would also serve in civic functions or royal courts. And these principles leached from the church into the secular sphere and began to influence the early parliaments. And indeed, the right that no taxation without representation was a direct effect of the canon law adoption and development of quod omnes tangit as a principle. So there was an enormous effect from canon law into the development of the early constitutional principles in the medieval world. So I don't think there would have been a great charter. There wouldn't have been, none of those things would have been there had it not been for these developments first within the church.
Just a quick break to let you know what's going on in the rest of the CatholicCulture.org podcast network. Relevant to the topic of today's episode is the latest episode of The Way of the Fathers. Mike Aquilina is covering the church father Lactantius. Lactantius, whose thought was influential on the Emperor Constantine, was an early advocate of freedom of conscience. On Catholic Culture audiobooks, James Majewski is continuing his reading of St. Augustine's classic work on the interpretation of Scripture, De Doctrina Christiana. And at Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, James and I discussed the classic World War I escape film, Grand Illusion. You can find all these shows in your favorite podcast app or by going to catholicculture.org/podcast. And just to remind you, all of our podcasts are funded by listener donations. So if you'd like to help us out, please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Yeah, that's really fascinating, and especially striking, within the church. Everybody always says the church is not a democracy, and that's true. And yet they thought it most prudent in certain circumstances, in a limited way, I suppose, to have what you might call a semi-democratic procedure for making decisions, at least within entities within the church.
Well, even the Pope was elected.
Right, exactly.
I can only want to add to this. In the secular realm, as they began to conform to these very same principles, the one was added that I mentioned earlier, that the people have a right to revolution. So if they're ruled without their consent tyrannically, they have a right to revolution. And again, this was universally recognized throughout the Middle Ages.
Right. At this point, we are seeing the beginnings of the idea of the requirement for consent. We're seeing the idea that the authority of the state resides essentially in the people and is bestowed upon the state by the people's consent. The right to revolution, as you've said, we're starting to get in this canon law, in at least limited contexts. We're getting the idea of representation as a possible way of the people expressing their consent and having more of a say in how they're governed.
That the right to representation is very interesting to see how that developed when the kings called the early parliaments. And who was it that could come to those parliaments and what they were authorized to do or say. And as the king did not want to waste time having such an assembly with people who didn't have the authority from those in their shire or in their township or in their county, he made sure that there was some means of selecting them so that they were invested with the authority to bind the people whom they represented when they made that decision in Parliament.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So just to get into a little more detail as to how this was implemented sort of on the level of the king, can we talk about the Coronation Charter and Magna Carta a little bit in terms of their some selective look at some of the principles involved that are important in considering kind of the provenance of America's Constitution?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about the Magna Carta is that it was inspired by Archbishop Stephen Langton, as it was Langton who gathered the nobles together and basically told them what to do and drafted Magna Carta. So the provisions in Magna Carta are a reflection of many of the things about which we spoke. And that includes, first of all, the first thing you read in Magna Carta is the king having to recognize the separate, legitimate sovereignty of the church in the secular sphere, and that the king will stop trespassing in that sphere, that he will not try to appoint abbots, he will not confiscate church property, he will not try to invest bishops, etc. So that was the first and considered at the time the most important. And the others with which, of course, you're very familiar, sort of an early version of jury trial and the rule of law.
I was actually inspired to go and read the whole Magna Carta online while I was reading this book. And there's a part towards the end, and granted, this is only in the first version of the Magna Carta, so it doesn't persist in subsequent versions over the next decade or however frequently it was updated. But I think it was in the 1215 version, the king actually gives permission for the people, or in the form of these barons, to seize government property if they feel that he has wronged them or transgressed the charter. In fact, he even says that he will compel them to swear that they will do so. If I can just read a little bit of this, because it's like more radical than our Constitution, because even our Constitution doesn't have, secession and, revolution explicitly built into it, even though it's kind of implicit in the historical circumstances of the Declaration of Independence and the founding. If we, our Chief Justice, our officials, or any of our servants, offend in any respect against any man, or transgress any of the articles of the peace or of this security, and the offense is made known to 4 of the said 25 barons, they shall come to us, or in our absence from the kingdom to the Chief Justice, to declare it and claim immediate redress. If we, or in our absence abroad, the Chief Justice make no redress within 40 days, reckoning from the day on which the offense was declared to us or to him, the 4 barons shall refer the matter to the rest of the 25 barons, who may distrain upon and assail us in every way possible, with the support of the whole community of the land, by seizing our castles, lands, possessions, or anything else, saving only our own person and those of the queen and our children, until they have secured such redress as they have determined upon. This is my favorite part. Having secured the redress, they may then resume their normal obedience to us. Which I find hilarious.
Well, I mean, you see in that a reflection of the early right to revolution.
Absolutely. But it's striking to see it put so explicitly. You also mention this idea in the development of canon law, the figure of Gratian, this idea of natural and divine law trumping human and also ecclesiastical positive law, which is very important. So we have this idea that the laws are not simply made by the king or even by a bishop or a pope, but that they are also accountable to a higher law. And that is very important. So you have this accountability in both directions, such that, when a king is determined to be a tyrant and in need of deposition by the people, it's because he's both a breaker of the contract with the people and perhaps failing to respect their ancient rights, but also as being himself a rebel against a law that is higher than he, which is very important that you have that in both, that accountability in both directions, I think, so that it's not just a matter of the people kind of demanding their conventional rights. It's not simply a matter of contract. It's also a matter of the king being accountable to a higher law than both himself and the people.
Yeah, I would only add to that the principles which I just mentioned to you as evolving out of canon law in the Middle Ages were themselves an expression of natural law. The equality of all people, natural law, the requirement of consent by free, rational people, that's from natural law. Well, the right to representation, how the consent is made. I mean, obviously, an element of convention enters into how that will be made. The right to revolution, that's also an expression of natural law. So the natural law, of course, was seen by the medieval thinkers and the greats like Thomas Aquinas as kind of a second revelation. You have the scriptures as God's direct revelation to man, but nature itself is a revelation, and the laws of nature are that revelation, and it is by apprehending them that man can understand right from wrong and what is just from what is unjust. And how can we do that? We can do that because we understand the nature of man, which means we understand what man's perfection means, what the end of man means, and what contributes to the achievement of that end, and what detracts from the achievement of that end. And obviously, those things that detract or subvert the end are evil, immoral, and those that add to it, that proceed along the path of that perfection, are moral. So that the power of natural law in terms of human beings means explicitly the moral law.
I see. Let me ask you this. In your book, you talk a lot about England, not exclusively. Clearly, these were principles that were recognized to some degree across Christendom. Are you only focusing on England because of its relevance to the American founding, or was England, even among the different parts of Christendom, was England especially concerned with or insightful about liberty in the Middle Ages compared with other parts of Christendom?
Yes. I mean, one reason to focus on England is because of its importance in the formation of the American colonies and the English principles of liberty. But there's another reason, too, that on the continent adopted Roman law through the influence of the Justinian Code, which contains that principle that what pleases the prince becomes law. That actually the law is kind of the product of the prince's will. Now, the English did not. When Roman law was sort of offered to them, let us say, they said, no thanks, we're going to stick to our common law. And that's why that deleterious principle from Roman law did not affect Great Britain to the extent that it did areas of the continent.
So before we get to some of my more general questions that I have here, let me just give people sort of like a quick idea of the rest of the book. So after the discussion of the Middle Ages, you go on to talk about how this vision of the natural law declined through voluntarism, the philosophy of William of Ockham, then the Protestant Revolt with Martin Luther and figures like that, how some of these principles of natural law were reclaimed within Anglicanism by the Anglican priest Richard Hooker, whose work was very much admired, and strikingly so, by Pope, I think it was Pope Clement VIII, I think I want to say. You talk about Hobbes and Locke, the debate over the divine right of kings. So you're not just sort of like naming these medieval principles and then sort of taking it for granted that they somehow influenced the founders. You kind of show the strange story of how these principles were fought over in subsequent centuries going up to the founding, and show similarities between the statements of the founders and those of the Catholic opponents of the divine right of kings, for example, like St. Robert Bellarmine and Suarez. So I thought that was worth mentioning. There's also a great chapter on the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which it just makes it abundantly clear that the two proceeded from an entirely different spirit. That I'm totally sold on that from reading that chapter.
Yeah, I think I should say to something which should have been said at the beginning of our discussion, that the fulcrum on which this entire book moves is the distinction between the primacy of reason and the primacy of will, power. And you see, and you just mentioned one of the names for the primacy of will when you used the term voluntarism, which is used in theology to describe the conception of God as being pure will and power, who can do anything, who is unrestrained and unconstrained by anything, maybe other than the principle of non-contradiction, that he's unaccountable, that he's incomprehensible? Or is the primacy of reason God's essence as logos, as St. John introduces him at the beginning of his electrifying gospel? This was the contest. Things moved back and forth along this line. And clearly, within the Middle Ages, it was the primacy of reason as against the primacy of will and power that was ascendant. And my contention is, with the loss of Christendom, and something that could be seen in the late Middle Ages with William of Ockham, who changed the central medieval teaching of the primacy of reason in God to one of the primacy of power and will in God. Thomas Aquinas said it's the divine intellect that directs the divine will. So it's reason that instructs, reason that decides, and the will executes what reason tells it to put this crudely. Occam flips the relationship and says, oh, no, it is the will that is primary and unconstrained, and reason is simply instrumental in executing what the will decides, and the will can decide anything. So that change affected everything, and it affected the political order too. It was the overthrow of Christendom, and Occam's thinking was adopted by Martin Luther, as I try to explain in the chapter on Luther, who denies all of the constitutional principles that were articulated in the Middle Ages.
And he completely rejected ecclesiastical law, as is discussed in a great book by R.H. Tawney, A Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. He goes into Luther's total rejection of the idea of canon law and the consequences that had.
He publicly burnt canon law, and he destroyed ecclesiastical corporations. There was no longer any dual sovereignty after he finished his demolition. But more importantly, he denied equality. He certainly denied the requirement of consent, right to representation, and he vehemently denied the right to revolution. And he said that the power of the prince came directly from God.
Yeah. And he execrated reason completely, almost completely. There's a lot of quotes in the chapter on Luther that are pretty shocking, to someone who's not aware of his opinions on the use and validity of reason.
Well, he execrated Thomas Aquinas. He execrated Aristotle. It was a denial of the validity of philosophy, a denial of natural law as it was classically understood. It was a pretty thorough demolition. So you can see that within Luther's theology, a political philosophy of the divine right of kings can easily develop, and did.
Right. Okay. So I have some kind of a number of questions that this book raised for me that I'd like to ask you. First, let's talk about the idea of consent. I don't know to what degree, the medievals kind of detailed the way that consent operates. I guess my question is, whose consent? How many? What does it mean for the people to consent? How many of them have to consent? Is it a majority? On what basis is the lack of consent of the minority, overridden? So that's an important question, I suppose, especially in the whole question of democracy. But how is that? What's the reasoning given for sort of like a certain majority of the people being sufficient for consent?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Pope came up with the 2/3 rule, but by whom is the consent expressed? And that's a story that evolved slowly over a period of time, as you saw enfranchisement increase. And that was true within the church as well, to the point that it reached inside dioceses and sort of even almost to the level of the parish priest. So as the reach of things affected more, those whom it reached were given the right to express their consent or not. So and of course you see that developing in different ways in different places according to the historical circumstances. As you mentioned, it was the Council of Barons, as a result of Magna Carta, who had that right of consent, and not so much the people at large, though in early parliaments it would reach down to knights and others and burghers. So there's kind of sort of a long history to the extent of enfranchisement. There was a practical aspect to that was recognized by the ruler. If he was going to collect those taxes, he didn't want a rebellion on his hands, so he wanted to make sure that those who were being taxed expressed themselves on the tax, that they at least the majority of them gave their assent. Now, I can't say that the 2/3 rule was adopted everywhere. I, to tell you the truth, haven't looked at what it was in various places at various times.
Yeah, I guess I'm just sort of curious on a natural law level as to, how do you justify with a certain level of consent kind of overriding, the wishes of a certain segment of the population. I suppose if they feel strongly enough about it, they can always secede, but
well, not necessarily. It depends on the terms of the political union that exists.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, what natural law would teach and demonstrate is that no matter what the majority approves, it can't approve anything that removes from the minority its basic rights.
I see.
It can't be a violation of their integrity as human beings. Yeah, but I mean, as a practical matter, in order to have a political rule of any kind that is based upon the consent of the people, that has to be the expression of the majority on things that are within the moral law, I would quickly add. The majority deciding things within the moral law, which there by definition means that cannot violate the rights of the minority.
I saw yesterday Dr. Adrian Vermeule posted on Twitter a passage from one of St. Augustine's dialogues. The founders are often quoted as saying, democracy only works if the people are virtuous. So St. Augustine poses a situation where the people are virtuous, and it's good to give them the ability to select their representatives. And then he says, but what happens if the people become corrupted and, votes are bought or stolen, and the people are only selecting corrupt rulers and representatives? So, yeah, I guess another question is, what if the people are so corrupt that they're not only are they unfit to choose their representatives, but what if the people will not give any consent to lawful rule? If consent is required, but also the natural law is required, and the people will not consent to anything, any legitimate rule, what happens? Are they to be just left to their own devices, or can a strong man step in? Because Augustine posits that in this situation, if the people are no longer morally fit to choose their representatives, it would be good if a strong man, a powerful and virtuous man, with the support of a few or perhaps only one person, would step in and take over from representative government.
Yeah, well, Thomas Aquinas says that same thing, and I've got the quote from him in my book, in which he states that if a people become corrupt, or some sector of the society becomes corrupt, that heretofore has selected its own rulers or representatives or the mayor of their village, if they are so corrupt as that they cannot do this responsibly, the right to consent should be withdrawn from them.
I see.
And returned to them only at such a time when virtue is restored.
So it's much like the right to life or anything else. It's not an absolute right.
Well, I mean, the founders made explicitly clear, I'd say they were unanimous on this, that the republic which they had created, not a democracy, but a republic, was totally dependent upon the virtue of the American people. And without that virtue, it could not possibly survive. I can't tell you the number of statements of exactly that I have found in them. And also, by the way, they also agreed, and it didn't matter how personally religious they happened to be, they all nonetheless agreed that the principal source for the development of the virtue of the people was religion. And therefore, religion needed to be sponsored and by the state.
My last question about consent is this. If consent is freely given by the people, why does it require grave reason, like a tyrant, for it to be withdrawn? If they can freely give their consent, why is it that they have to have any justification at all for withdrawing it and changing their government?
Well, again, we have to make sure that we're always talking about they can't consent to just anything. They can only consent to those things which are within the moral law. Jefferson makes a statement, I think, in the notes on the state of Virginia, where he says, the people are sovereign in all things, but only under the moral law. In fact, they're invested with their sovereignty by the moral law. So it can't just choose anything. It can't just haphazardly go one way or the other. But it depends what constitutional arrangement has been approved and under which they live as far as changing their form of government. If there's no provision for that, well, then it would require the overthrow of the government. And are there legitimate moral reasons for such an overthrow? That would be the question.
That makes sense, because even if in theory they could change their form of government whenever they please without any really grave reason, there would still need to be a grave reason to probably justify the tumult that might create anyway, especially if the ruler were to resist.
Again, we just back on the question of virtue. I mean, they agreed that people who were incapable of ruling themselves, who were incapable of self-rule, by which they meant morally ruling themselves, would be ruled by someone else.
Right.
That this was sort of an iron law of history. And that's right. Why they said, if you want to keep this republic, you must be a virtuous people. And the inimical thing, if I just could jump ahead, in the kinds of decisions we've seen from the Supreme Court, and certainly those which typified so many decisions, Anthony Kennedy, is that is the erasure of the distinction between vice and virtue. And to say that whether something is a vice or whether it's a virtue depends on how the individual person regards it. So he adopted this radical individual autonomy, which is nowhere present in the American founding and would be inimical to the thinking of the American founders.
Yes, so, you make a very strong case in the book that the founders believed in a version of natural law that is recognizable to Catholics and to the classical tradition. Whether it's identical in every detail, it could be debated, but basically that they believed that there was a natural moral law and that both, democracy or a democratic republic and liberty were subject to that. And as you say, would be quickly lost without following it.
And as you know, because you already mentioned it, in part of the book, I offer parallel statements from the great Robert Bellarmine, from Francisco Suarez, I deal with Richard Hooker earlier, but from the author of Discourses on Government, Algernon Sidney, who was, of course, he was an Anglican as well. And from the Declaration of, and also, I deal, of course, with Locke and with the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And that they all sound like paraphrases of each other. It's startling how close they are. And of course, it's startling to hear from Suarez and Bellarmine statements that sound like they came from the Declaration of Independence. Those who think that these are products of the Enlightenment are suffering from temporal provincialism, as they predate the Enlightenment considerably. And I'm not saying, you can say the same thing, but mean something different from it. So I don't want to carry that too far, but the continuity is really striking.
Yes, I agree.
It's also, isn't it delicious that all those who think that the divine right of kings was a creation of medieval Christendom will find that the greatest defense against the divine right of kings came from a Catholic cardinal and a Spanish Jesuit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before we get to some contemporary papal statements, which I'd like to discuss, one more question about revolution. There's a bit on page, let's see, it's in the chapter on Locke, and it's just a quote that I found striking. Out of many quotes in the book from Catholic and other thinkers on the justification for revolution against a tyrant, Locke says, if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design, you include in brackets, of tyranny visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. Now, this just made me think, and it's certainly a thought that I've had before. Has there been a single moment in American history since the founding when a revolution couldn't have been justified based on that? I mean, thinking first of slavery, certainly a revolution by the slaves would have been justified. Now, obviously, in Catholic moral teaching, you have to have something to replace the regime that you've overthrown. So there are prudential reasons why it might not be a good idea. But just simply based on the fact of tyranny, a revolution by the slaves would have been justified. And then I think of the past 100 years. I mean, there have been periods where, such at the beginning of state-mandated schooling, where homeschooling was illegal for several decades, the right to educate your children as you see fit. And that alone is much more grave than, anything that King George was trying to do, as far as I know, to the colonies. So I suppose, this isn't an essential point to your book, but it just seems to me that revolution could have been justified against the American state at almost any point in American history from one group or another.
Well, there was the Whiskey Rebellion, which you didn't mention.
Oh, yeah, that's true. But it's just very striking that, I think of education alone, among many other things, and certainly of everything that's going on now, as ample justification, if it were possible prudentially to accomplish it, of a revolution.
I always think that's the big question, and prudence has got to be the guiding virtue on this. And unfortunately, what we have seen in the recent past, and by the recent past, I would include the last 50 years, is the progressive diminishment of our freedoms and the enhancement of the power of the state, to where it's exceedingly clear that what is developing in the United States is a Leviathan state, exactly as it was understood and described by Thomas Hobbes. And you mentioned matters of education. Of course, there's the horror of abortion. You can't defend the lives of the most defenseless innocents in our society. There is a grave and horrible thing taking place. But you've got to, it's like the contest over slavery. I forget now who was the famous guy who said the Constitution was a covenant with hell or with the devil and needed to be destroyed.
I think it was Harrison or Garrison.
Garrison. There it was Garrison. So
the abolitionist.
So that was imprudent. And was thought to be so by Frederick Douglass, the former slave who wanted to see improvement within the Constitution. But of course, that resulted in a terrible civil war. Now, so we're seeing, and of course, I would just add something that the features of the Leviathan state, I think, have been manifested particularly during the coronavirus.
Oh, absolutely.
Whereas any sensible person would say there need to be the provision for some health measures in the light of this highly contagious virus. We're seeing more than that, particularly by certain governors who assume upon themselves absolute powers. And living in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I was struck by our governor deciding what was an essential service, which had to continue, and what was non-essential.
Absolutely.
Going to church was non-essential, so you couldn't do that. However, abortion was essential.
Yes, yeah.
So you could do that. So you see here the face of Leviathan.
Yes. I'm about to speak with Douglas Farrow, who wrote a couple of excellent essays in Catholic World Report on this, on the church in relation to the state in the response to the coronavirus. And, what's happening here is bad, but it's nothing compared to what's happening in parts of Australia, where they've locked people into their apartment buildings without warning. They're sending high-powered drones out to search for people who aren't wearing masks outside. It's really madness over in Victoria.
Yeah, well, it gives the state an opportunity to flex its muscles,
Absolutely.
and therefore we can see the strength that it has developed. And obviously, as we are going into a very interesting election season, we'll see what happens in a society in which a number of people have predicted a new civil war. At least we already know there's a cultural civil war, except one that's largely over because the liberal forces generally in charge of the academy and the media and the culture have won that with very little resistance from conservative sources.
Speaking of contemporary politics, towards the end of the book, you had a quote from Barack Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, where he says the Constitution, built into the Constitution, is the idea that there's no such thing as absolute truth, because they didn't want to lock, I think he says, they didn't want to lock future generations into an unchangeable path. So for him, absolute truth is a form of slavery. And so you can see that the attack on the Constitution has two prongs. First are the people who just want to say, well, it's all a bunch of racist, white supremacist garbage and the Constitution doesn't matter. And second, the people who want to subvert the Constitution in an equally destructive way by saying it's a morally relativist document.
Yeah, to quote him, implicit in the Constitution's structure, in the very idea of ordered liberty, was a rejection of absolute truth, unquote. Well, what if it's ordered liberty and there's no absolute truth?
What's ordering it?
Yeah, what is ordering the liberty? And the answer, of course, is just will. It's the primacy of will and the loss of the primacy of reason. And it was on the primacy of reason that the United States was founded. So when you have the president of a country saying such a thing, denying the foundations of the country, you know what a dire situation we're in.
Finally, we come to one of my biggest concerns with regard to the American founding in relation to Catholic principles. I would say my two biggest concerns are with non-establishment of religion and free speech in the sense that it's understood by the founders. And this was echoed in one of the articles in the Catholic World Report Symposium on the book, which I'll link to in the show notes for this episode. Well, let me start here, actually. In the book, you cite Father John Carroll, who became one of, or perhaps, was he the first bishop in America? He was the first American bishop, and he was the cousin of Charles Carroll, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He wrote to an English priest, "I am glad to inform you that the fullest and largest system of toleration is adopted in almost all the American states. Public protection and encouragement are extended alike to all denominations, and Roman Catholics are members of Congress, assemblies, and hold civil and military posts as well as others." Now, obviously, this is a praiseworthy thing, this toleration of Catholicism, especially in the context of recent history. In his encyclical letter to the American bishops, Pope Leo XIII said as much, but he also didn't think that this was sufficient. in this encyclical Longinqua, after praising America's tolerance of the church, Leo said, "Yet, though all this is true, it would be very erroneous to draw the conclusion that in America is to be sought the type of the most desirable status of the church, or that it would be universally lawful or expedient for state and church to be, as in America, dissevered and divorced. The fact that Catholicity with you is in good condition, nay, is even enjoying a prosperous growth, is by all means to be attributed to the fecundity with which God has endowed his church, in virtue of which, unless men or circumstances interfere, she spontaneously expands and propagates herself. But she would bring forth more abundant fruits if, in addition to liberty, she enjoyed the favor of the laws and the patronage of the public authority." Now, this is a limited statement, and I hope you'll forgive me if I quote extensively from Leo, also in Immortale Dei, simply because I know that for many people this is a controversial point. So, Dignitatis Humanae, as we all know, says that the state may not coerce people in religious matters, or that the state may not force people to believe something they don't believe or anything like that. And that's a longstanding principle of Catholicism, that people are not to be coerced into accepting the Catholic faith. However, Dignitatis Humanae nor previous church teaching say that the state should not establish a religion as officially the true one or especially favorite, nor do they say that the state and the church may not take steps to prohibit the dissemination of opinions contrary to the natural law, or of blasphemy or heresy. And again, I beg your bearing with me here as I quote from a few passages from Immortale Dei. And that's just because if I just simply say a summary of what I think the church is teaching on this is, people probably won't take it for granted. So in Immortale Dei, Pope Leo, and he isn't the only pope to say this, but I'm using this particular encyclical, he says, "The state constituted as it is clearly bound to act up to the manifold and weighty duties linking it to God by the public profession of religion." And in a subsequent passage, he makes clear what he means by religion, saying, "No one is allowed to be remiss in the service due to God, and since the chief duty of all men is to cling to religion in both its teaching and practice, not such religion as they may have a preference for, but the religion which God enjoins and which certain and most clear marks show to be the only one and true religion." So he's not talking about religion generically, but of the specific true religion. He says we are bound absolutely to worship God in that way which he has shown to be his will. All rule, therefore, would hold in honor the holy name of God, and one of their chief duties must be to favor religion. Again, he's talking about specifically about the Catholic faith, to protect it, to shield it under the credit and sanction of the laws, and neither to organize nor enact any measure that may compromise its safety. And finally, in relation to this John Carroll quote, where he says that the state favors and tolerates all religions alike, Leo says, "The church indeed deems it unlawful to place the various forms of divine worship on the same footing as the true religion, but does not on that account condemn those rulers who, for the sake of securing some great good or of hindering some great evil, allow patiently custom or usage to be a kind of sanction for each kind of religion having its place in the state. And in fact, the churches want to take earnest heed that no one shall be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will." So the point I'm driving at is not that it's a problem that the Constitution does not establish Catholicism on the national level. That's not the issue, because the popes have said that, for various prudential reasons, even though this is the ideal, there may be good reason in any given situation not to do so. But I guess the problem seems to be that the Constitution forbids it in principle, and that this has been embedded in the attitude of American Catholics to the extent that many American Catholics would say that there's something wrong in principle with a confessional state. Not only that it's not the ideal, but that there is actually something almost sinister about it. So I'm curious about what your view is on the Constitution, not just not establishing Catholicism, but forbidding it in principle to be done.
Well, it only forbids it insofar as the national government is concerned, because, as you know, the Constitution creates rather, in fact, a completely novel arrangement of dual sovereignty of the federal government and the state governments. And they have different responsibilities. And it says nothing prohibiting the states from establishing religion, having state religions. In fact, 9 of the 13 had state religions.
Right. Yeah, that's an important point.
It was only that the national government had no business doing that. I had a very interesting discussion with Father Fessio, the head of Ignatius Books, doing a little book club online discussion of my book, and he mentioned, isn't it a failure in the Constitution not to have made explicit the central importance of family, United States of America? And my response was that family law was within the purview of the states exclusively, and it would have been seen as completely inappropriate for the federal government to say anything about it. That was a matter of state law.
Not that at this point it might not be welcome to have an amendment dealing with the rights of families. I've been reading the early documents of Catholic social teaching and am struck by just how central the rights of the family and the rights of the father are in that teaching.
Yeah, well, what I think you have found is it is not so much the federal government as it is the federal courts and the Supreme Court that have assaulted the family, quite unlike what had been the case in federal and Supreme Court rulings, say, in the 19th century, the early 20th century. I never didn't mention this to you, but in this book I wrote called Making Gay Okay, How Rationalizing Homosexual Behavior is Changing Everything, I read every court decision, Supreme Court, federal court, some state courts, affecting this issue of homosexual marriage. And that brought me to earlier court rulings that asserted exactly the opposite of what the modern rulings were as to the importance and integrity of the family as between a man and a woman, as was known from time immemorial. So it was the court that performed the destruction there. But I'm sorry, I've moved away from your question about a confessional state. Okay, we know that the states themselves could have them, but not the federal government, could not impose a national religion. Now, Massachusetts behaved very much in the way in which Pope Leo described a state should, in its promotion of religion and having public prayer, public church events.
Presumably not the Catholic religion, but just as an example.
Which everyone was required to attend. But of course, it was Calvinism,
right.
not Catholicism. So that's why Father John Carroll, then Bishop Carroll, and other Catholics at the time were ecstatic over the success of the revolution and then of the Constitution, because this country, as you are aware, had very severe prejudices against Catholics. And in fact, in certain colonies and states, Catholics were not allowed to hold public office.
That's right.
Except that once the Constitution removed any religious test for office, then Catholics could serve in those offices. That's why it was tremendously good news for the church.
Right.
Now, the larger question of a confessional state has to be addressed within the context of the havoc wreaked in the religious wars on the continent and in England.
Yes, absolutely.
Which led to people like John Locke and even Hobbes to figure out how can we live together peacefully when there are different Christian sects that interpret Scripture differently, and particularly if they live according to some kind of sola scriptura interpretation. There are no means, it seems, on religion alone to reach some peaceable way of being together. Or should we just continue to kill each other until one side wins? Or are there grounds for moderating that behavior. And that, of course, was Locke's major enterprise, and why he came up with the state of nature to try to explain a grounds on which everyone could agree and within which there could be religious toleration.
Right.
So that problem would continue to obtain, and it was, as you know, so many of the colonists were there because they had fled religious persecution on the continent.
I think the answer about this religious establishment on the state level is a pretty good one. I suppose someone could say, well, doesn't church teaching kind of imply that the true religion should be recognized on every level, not just the state level, or at least at the highest level? But then, of course, you could always debate what's truly higher in the United States. Is it the federal government or is the states? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it wasn't as clear. Obviously, de facto now it's the federal government, but originally, it was a little bit of a different, supposed to be a different sort of relationship.
There needs to be a note of realism injected in here. I've lived in Europe. My wife is Spanish. I've spent a fair amount of time in Spain. I've spent a good deal of time in France, England, elsewhere. And of course, Spain is a Catholic country. And even though it's a socialist one now, and has been an anti-clerical one for quite some time, it's not doing very well. Italy is not doing very well. In fact, all of these erstwhile Catholic countries are in many respects in worse shape than the United States.
Sure, that's true. Of course, that doesn't change the essential obligation, that Leo lays out for society as a whole to recognize the true religion. It just means they should follow through better, right?
Well, I'd say one reason why the church was devastated in Europe was because of the marriage of crown and altar that took place after the Reformation, where Catholicism survived. It did so because the king or the prince was a Catholic, and the church became very much more dependent on the king and the prince, therefore, and therefore an avid supporter of royalty. So much so that the distinction was lost between throne and altar.
Right.
And when the throne was overthrown, people thought it was necessary to overthrow the church as well, because the two had become so closely identified with each other. So that led to this tremendous anti-clericalism that obtains in many parts of Europe still today. So that didn't work out too well.
Sure. Well, obviously, there's all sorts of issues with how exactly this recognition of the true religion would be implemented, and the prudential issues of it. I just think it's striking. It's sad that many, I don't know how it is elsewhere, but many modern Catholics, many American Catholics, genuinely think that a confessional state would be a bad thing in principle, or that it's not the ideal as the church has taught. They think that Dignitatis Humanae, changed all that. Speaking of which, I'd like to look at the one final issue, also having to do with the First Amendment, that being of free speech. In Immortale Dei, Leo XIII says, "The liberty of thinking and of publishing whatsoever each one likes without any hindrance is not in itself an advantage over which society can wisely rejoice. On the contrary, it is the fountainhead and origin of many evils." And he goes on to say later, "Whatever therefore is opposed to virtue and truth may not rightly be brought temptingly before the eye of man, much less sanctioned by the favor and protection of the law." So obviously we know, anybody who knows about the history of free speech in America knows that the founders did not consider freedom of speech to include publishing obscenity. So I think the founders would have, we can agree, the founders would have not approved of pornography, for example, being covered under free speech. What about blasphemy? Would that have been considered something that should be prohibited, like sort of like blatantly offensive blasphemy?
It was.
It was?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess the next question would be, what about just not sort of like outright insulting language, but sort of philosophy that is wicked or grossly erroneous, grossly contrary to the natural law. So the church has said traditionally that the state would have a right and even a duty to curb that sort of thing, and that the church does have a right to not to coerce people in their private beliefs, but to stop the dissemination of heresy, for example, as something harmful to souls and to the civil society as well. So that's another question I have about the Constitution, is that it seems to at least prohibit the state from stopping the spread of harmful opinions.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, the freedom of religion is the first freedom mentioned, and the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech are political freedoms, but again, they need to be understood within the moral law. That's why libel would not be included within that freedom.
Right.
And as I mentioned, many state laws, blasphemy was against the law.
Yeah, that's
libel was against the law. Incitement was against the law. Now, I don't know. Once you get into the realm of the expression of erroneous opinion should be banned, I think you've crossed a line there that I don't think that then you can't have freedom of expression, because every argument is that one side considers the other side wrong.
Sure. Well, I guess it would be maybe past a certain threshold. I mean, for example, the church's traditional teaching would I think, based on what Leo says and what other popes said elsewhere, that whatever is opposed to virtue and truth may not be rightly be brought temptingly before the eye of man, much less sanctioned by the favor and protection of law. That that you don't have the liberty to think and publish whatever you like without any hindrance. I would think the church that would at least imply that, for example, in principle, the state could and perhaps should prohibit, ban the writings of Marx, for example, or Nietzsche. I mean, there may be prudential reasons not to in any given situation, but again, my main concern is that the Constitution seems to prohibit this in principle. So that freedom of publishing, as Leo puts it, whatsoever each one likes without hindrance is considered to be an advantage over which society can wisely rejoice in the Constitution.
Yeah, but I don't think that was understood. I mean, it wasn't what you like. That's why they could ban pornography until, of course, the Supreme Court stepped in and said that, one man's pornography is another man's art, that it couldn't make the moral distinction between pornography and art, which is, another abdication of reason. Again, I think that this discussion has to focus on reasonable disagreements, the expression of which must be allowed if there's going to be free government.
Right. Yeah, I certainly agree. But, don't you think the works of Marx, there would be a good case, for example, of prohibiting those as simply inimical to society itself?
Of course, I've read Marx and I've read Nietzsche, and I couldn't have operated as I have as a foot soldier in the Cold War had I not read Marx and Lenin.
But back in the day, you would have had to get a special permission because they would have been on the index, and I don't see anything wrong with that.
But even the church got rid of the index. So, I mean, it's not, and also it's simply, it's impracticable. And who is going to make that, who's going to assemble the index here? It says, look, there are certain sensible things. For instance, freedom of religion does not mean any religion, only those religions compatible with the expression of the principles on which the United States is based. Let me say compatible with the natural theology contained in the Declaration of Independence. So that...
Well, that would seem to exclude Marx.
As a religion, that's right. And of course, it is a pseudo-religion, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Now, that means the Incas could not revive their religion here with human sacrifice because it's a violation of the inalienable right to life, right? So, and it's why any sensible court would have upheld a law against Satanism.
Right. Even as an opinion, not simply as a, if they were doing things that were against the law, right?
Well, there's a church. There's a Church of Satanism in San Francisco, and there are the Wiccans, which is all of this nonsense that is being allowed here for the same reason as expressed in Obama's statement that our ordered liberty is based on there being no objective truth. But of course, there wouldn't be the United States were there no objective truth. So that's why I object to those who say, well, we're in this condition today because of the American founding, when these things are inimical to the American founding, when they're not the product of it. And as I say, I have a brief epilogue in the book, which perhaps you had time to read, where I suggest from where these deleterious influences came.
Yeah, German historicism.
Historicism, relativism, progressivism. And you see in people like President Wilson.
Yeah.
The great progenitor of progressivism.
Well, that's why I said the past 100 years when I was talking about reasons to revolt.
And John Dewey, who ruined the education system in this country, both of whom despised the preamble of the Declaration of Independence as it contained those founding principles of our country. I mean, that's what happened to us, and this and what this has unleashed is the primacy of will, and nowhere is this seen more clearly than the mobs in the streets of the United States.
Absolutely.
Who have abandoned reason completely, and who, by the way, as you know, some of whom are pseudo-Marxists to the extent to which they're capable of reading anything. And by the way, I would just, if I could only make one more comment about this particular thing, is it represents the re-tribalization of mankind.
Yeah, I had the same thought. At the beginning of your book, you say something very striking, which is that the word barbarian, I mean, I'm kind of glossing your comment. The word barbarian was not just like an insult, a slur against those who were different. It specifically meant those who could not basically recognize people outside of the tribe as human. And it was the mark of civilization to be able to do that. And I immediately thought of Marx's idea of class consciousness, which has been adopted in various forms in intersectional ideology and things like that, because he denies the universality of reason. He says that each person, their reasoning is just a function of the class they belong to. And if you don't follow your class consciousness, then you have what's called false consciousness, as in, when an African American has opinions that he's not supposed to have, he's called an Uncle Tom. That's the modern version of false consciousness. So Marx, actually Marxism and the identity politics people are barbarians in that technical sense that you lay out.
Yes, or you have the race consciousness present today, which a form of race consciousness that took over a country was Nazism. That was race consciousness. It was the race theory of history as against Marx's class theory of history. And the people today, again, if you in that first part of the book where I describe what the tribal mentality is like, and I give descriptions of how tribes behaved, and where tribes still exist today, how they behave. And it's very much the way these people are behaving, because the primary in identity politics is color or class or gender or whatever it may be that trumps one's humanity and takes from them the ability to recognize another person as a human being. So this is the re-barbarization of our civilization to the extent to which they're allowed to succeed. The Marxists tried, the Nazis tried, now these people are trying.
Let me just ask a quick addendum to my question on free speech, and forgive my ignorance of American law. But you were saying how the Constitution's forbidding establishment of religion, of a particular religion on the federal level, didn't apply to the states. Is that also true of free speech? In other words, if you had an established religion on a state level, could that state forbid the publication of heresy at the state level as well? Because I've heard some people say the Constitution, like certain amendments of the Constitution, also somehow apply to the state level, or is that a current debate in legal scholarship, or how does that work?
No, of course the amendments apply to the states. You mean the constitutional amendments?
And yet you said, but you said that the states could have an established religion, which the Constitution.
Yeah, there was no amendment to the Constitution affecting the states' rights to establish a religion. The states themselves chose, over the course of years to disestablish their state religions.
So what about the freedom of the press? Is that something that applies on the state level via the federal Constitution?
Well, there are state laws regulating that,
Well, sure. But I just mean on the constitutional level, kind of in principle.
No, in principle, it exists for the entire country, for all people.
I'm just trying to figure it out, because if it were true, so your defense in terms of established religion was that it doesn't prevent the states from doing so. But it sounds like we don't have that same defense in terms of the freedom to publish whatever opinions one likes, which from Pope Leo XIII's point of view would be a bad thing.
There were state laws regulating what was published, and most specifically forbidding pornography or libel. And it was the appeal through state courts, which usually upheld the state laws, which then was appealed to a federal court and then to the Supreme Court that overturned them.
Right. I guess. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what is the scope on the state level for an established religion for the, prohibition of publication of vicious philosophies or heresy or whatever.
Whatever extent it existed, it's gone, thanks to the federal court rulings.
But at the beginning, it might not have been totally off the table for the states to do such a thing, in terms of opinions, not just obscenity or pornography.
Opinions. I would have to take a look at that. Yeah,
because that would kind of affect my view of the Constitution's compatibility with certain church teachings that have been sort of swept under the rug in the past several decades. Well, I think we should probably wrap up. I don't think we can totally resolve that here, but I'm grateful for you to be so generous with your time. We talked for a long time, and I really enjoyed it. I would urge people to pick this book up. Don't just listen to the interview. I mean, I had no intention of. Sometimes I'll do an interview where we kind of go through the whole book in short form, and this one we didn't. But I hope that gives you a taste of it. And again, the book is America on Trial: A Defense of the Founding from Ignatius Press, and I really think that this is a book that should be used, as our CatholicCulture.org writer Phil Lawler said in his review of the book. It should be used in college courses on the founding, and certainly I think homeschooling parents would find it to be a great work to use with their high schoolers as well. So I highly recommend getting a copy of this book in particular. This will be on my best books of 2020 end of the year list for sure. So Robert, thank you again for coming on the show.
Thomas, thank you very much.
And maybe I can have you again to talk about music sometime, because I'm a musician and this show is primarily an arts and culture show. So that would be.
Oh, I'd be delighted, particularly since there is a renaissance in extremely good music today.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Robert. God bless you.
Yeah.